page 322, chapter 11, still part 3, volume 2, the Loyalists. Good morning, or good day, wherever you are. But I hear an angry roar of voices. The comrades' patience has run out. They will slam my book shut, toss it away, and spit on it. Quote, in the last analysis, this is brazen impudence. It's slander. Where is he looking for genuine politicals? Whom is he writing about? About some priests, technocrats, sniveling schoolboys? The real politicals are us the unshakable, us the orthodox, crystal clear people, unquote. And Orwell called them good thinkers. Us, who even in the camp stayed faithful to the very end, to the one and only true. Yes, judging by our present publishers, you were the only ones imprisoned by and large. Only you suffered. You are the only ones allowed to write about this. The only ones we are allowed to write about. All right, let's do it. Will the reader agree with this criterion? That political prisoners are those who know what they are serving time for and are firm in their convictions? If you agree, then here is the answer. Our unshakable communists, who, despite their personal arrest, remain devoted to the one and only true, etc., were firm in their convictions, but did not know what they were serving time for, and therefore they cannot be considered political prisoners. If my criterion is no good, then let us take the criterion of Anna Skripnikova, who, in the course of her 5 terms, had time enough to think the matter over. And here it is. A political prisoner, quote, a political prisoner is one with beliefs whose renunciation could secure his release. People with such beliefs are political riffraff. Unquote. In my opinion, this is not a bad criterion. All those who at any time have been persecuted for ideology fit into it. All revolutionaries fit into it. All the so-called nuns and the archpriests, Prior Brzezinski fit into it, and Engineer Polchinski, but the Orthodox communists do not. Which beliefs are they being required to renounce? None, and that means that the Orthodox communists, even though it is insinuating to put it this way, are like that tailor and the deaf and dumb man and the club watchman, who fitted into the categories of helpless, uncomprehending victims, but with arrogance. Let us be precise and define our subject. Who are we going to be dealing with in this chapter? With all those who, despite their imprisonment, the mockery of an interrogation, their undeserved sentence, and the subsequent searing camp experiences, retained their communist convictions. No, not about all of them. Among them were people for whom this communist faith was an inner thing, sometimes the sole meaning of the lives remaining to them, but they did not let it lead them into taking a party attitude toward their imprisoned comrades, and in cell and barracks arguments they did not shout at others that these latter and had been justly imprisoned, meaning that I was imprisoned unjustly. They did not rush to declare the citizen camp chief and the security chief, I am a communist, and did not use this formula to survive in camp. And now, when speaking of the past, they do not see the principal and only violence of the camps to have consisted in the fact that communists were imprisoned and spit on all the rest. It is, in a word, they were those whose communist convictions were inward and not constantly on the tips of their tongues. It was as if this were an individualist trait, But in fact, such individuals did not ordinarily hold big jobs in freedom, and in camp they worked as ordinary sloggers. Take, for example, Avner Borisov, a village school teacher. Do you remember our youth? I myself was born in 1912, when our supreme happiness was the green Ljungström. Oh. When our supreme happiness was the green Ljungström uniform made out of homespun cloth, with a waist belt and a shoulder strap, when we despised money and everything private and personal, and were ready to march in any cause as soon as the summons came. I joined the Komsomol at the age of 13, and when I was all of 24 years old, the NKVD organs charged me with nearly every section of Article 58. We will see later how he conducted himself after his release. He is a decent person. Or Boris Mikhailovich Vinogradov, with whom I served time in prison. In his youth, he had been a locomotive engineer, not just for 1 year either, in the way that certain deputies were shepherds for a year. After the workers' school and an institute, he became a railway transport engineer and was not put immediately on party work, as often happens too. And he was a good engineer. In the Shrajka, he carried out complex calculations in gas dynamics for jet turbines. But by 1941, it's true, he had become the party organizer of the Moscow Institute for Railroad Engineering. In the bitter Moscow days of October 16th and 17th, 1941, seeking instructions, he telephoned, but no one replied. He went to the district party committee, the city party committee, the provincial party committee, and found no one there. Everyone had scattered to the winds. Their chambers were empty, and it seems he didn't go any higher than that. He returned to his own people in the institute and declared, "Comrades, all the leaders have run away, but we are communists. We will join the defense." And they did just that. But for that remark of his, they have all run away. Those who had run away sent him, who had not run away, to prison for 8 years for anti-Soviet propaganda. He was a quiet worker, a dedicated friend, and only in his heart-to-heart conversation would he disclose that he believes, and will go on believing, and he never wore it on his sleeve. Or take the geologist Nikolai Kalistratovich Govorko, who, when he was at Vorkuta last winter, composed his Ode to Stalin, which has been preserved, but he did not write it for publication, nor in order to receive privileges in return, but because it poured straight from his heart, and he hit that ode in the mine. Though, what was there to hide? Sometimes such people kept their faith to the end. Sometimes, like Kovacs, a Hungarian from Philadelphia arrested in 1937, who belonged to one of the 39 families who had come to found a commune near Kakovka. They refused, after rehabilitation, to take back their party card. Certain others broke away even earlier, like another Hungarian named Sapo, who had been commander of a Siberian partisan detachment in the Civil War. Back in 1937, he had declared in prison, "If I were free right now, I'd collect my partisans together, raise Siberia, and march on Moscow and chase all those bastards out." So we're not going to deal in this chapter with communists of either the first or second kind, and the Orthodox communists themselves have eliminated all those who broke with the party, like the two Hungarians. Nor will we be concerned with such anecdotal individuals as those who, in prison, only pretended to be Orthodox communists, so that the cell stoolie would give the interrogator a good report, like the young Podvarkov who, when free, had pasted up leaflets, but in the Spassk camp used to argue loudly with all opponents of the regime, including his own father, counting on lightening his own fate by this means. Here we shall concern ourselves particularly with those orthodox communists who made a display of their ideological orthodoxy, first to the interrogator, then in the prison cells, and then in camp to all and everyone, and now recall their camp past in this light. By a strange selective process, none of them will be sloggers. Such people ordinarily had held big jobs before their arrest and had had an enviable situation, and in camp they found it hardest of all to reconcile themselves to extinction, and they had fought fiercest of all to rise above universal zero. In this category were all the interrogators, prosecutors, judges, and camp officials who had landed behind bars, and all the theoreticians, dogmatists, and loudmouths. The writer G. Serbyakova, B. Dyakov, and Alden Semenov belong here and nowhere else. We have to understand them, and we won't scoff at them. It was painful for them to fall. When you cut down trees, the chips will fly. It was a cheerful proverb of justification. And then suddenly, they themselves were chopped off with all the other chips. Prokhorov Pastover describes a scene at Manzovka, a special camp of Vanlag at the beginning of 1938. To the surprise of all the natives, they brought in some sort of unprecedented special contingent and separated from the others with great secretiveness. No one had ever yet observed such an arrival. The newcomers wore leather coats, fur caps, woolen and Cheviot suits, fashionable shoes, and Oxfords. By the 20th century of the Revolution, this select group had already discovered the standard of taste in clothes, which was not available to working people. Because of bad management, or out of mockery, the camp authorities didn't give them work clothes and drove them out just as they were, in their chevalets and chrome leather, to dig ditches in liquid clay up to their knees. At the junction of the wheelbarrow, run one zek, upset a wheelbarrow with cement, and the cement poured out. A thief brigadier ran up, cursed the zek at fault, and pushed him back. "Pick it up with your hands, stupid." And the zek shouted hysterically, "How dare you taunt me? I am a former prosecutor of the Republic." And big tears rolled down his face. "What the bleep do I care if you're a prosecutor of the Republic, scum? I'll put your snoot in that cement, then you'll be a prosecutor. Now you're an enemy of the people, and you've got to put your nose to the grindstone." However, it appears that the work supervisor intervened on behalf of the prosecutor. Now, just tell us of a scene like that involving Sarah's prosecutor in a concentration camp in 1918. No one would have dreamed taking pity on him. It was unanimously recognized that they were not people, and the sentences they had sought for the defendants they had prosecuted had been 1 year, 3 years, 5. But how was it possible not to take pity on one's own Soviet proletarian prosecutor, even if he was dressed in a woolen suit? Sentences, he demanded, were a 10-ruble bill and the super. To say that things were painful for them is to say almost nothing. They were incapable of assimilating such a blow, such a downfall, and from their own people too, from their dear party, and for all appearances, for nothing at all. After all, they had been guilty of nothing as far as the party was concerned, nothing at all. It was painful to them. It was painful for them to such a degree that it was considered taboo among them, uncomradely, to ask, "What were you in prison for?" The only squeamish generation of prisoners. The rest of us, in 1945, with tongues hanging out, used to recount our arrests, couldn't wait to tell the story to every chance newcomer we met, and to the whole cell, as if it were an anecdote. Here's the sort of people they were. Olga's Leosberg husband had already been arrested, and they had come to carry out a search and arrest her too. The search lasted for hours, and she spent those 4 hours sorting out the minutes of Congress of Stakhanovitz, of the bristle and brush industry, of which she had been secretary until the previous day. The incomplete state of the miniature troubled her even more. The incomplete state of the minute troubled her even more than her children, whom she was leaving forever. Even the interrogator conducting the search could not resist telling her, "Come on now, say farewell to your children." Here's the sort of people that they were. A letter from her 15-year-old daughter came to Elizaveta Tsevakova in the Kazan prison for long-term prisoners. "Mama, tell me, write to me, are you guilty or not? I hope you weren't guilty, because then I won't join the Komsomol and I won't forgive them because of you. But if you are guilty, I won't write to you anymore and I will hate you." And the mother was stricken by remorse in her damp, grave-like cell with its dim little lamp. How could her daughter live without the Komsomol? How could she be permitted to hate Soviet power? Better that she should hate me. And she wrote, "I am guilty. Enter the Komsomol." How could it be anything but hard? It was more than the human heart could bear to fall beneath the beloved axe, then to have to justify its wisdom. But that is the price man pays for entrusting his God-given soul to human dogma. Even today, any Orthodox communist will affirm that Svetskova acted correctly. Even today, they cannot be convinced that it is precisely the perversion of small forces that the mother perverted her daughter and harmed her soul. Here's the sort of people they were. Y2 gave sincere testimony against her husband, anything to aid the party. Oh, how one could pity them, if at least they had come to comprehend their former wretchedness. This whole chapter would have been written quite differently if today, at least, they had forsaken their earlier views. But it happened the way Maria Danielyan had dreamed it would. If I leave here someday, I'm going to live as if nothing had taken place. Loyalty, and in our view, is just plain pig-headedness. These devotees of the theory of development construe loyalty to that development to mean renunciation of any personal development whatsoever. As Nikolai Adamovich Vilenchik said after serving 17 years, "We believed in the party, and we were not mistaken." Is this loyalty or pig-headedness? No, it was not for the show and not out of hypocrisy that they argued in cells in defense of the government's actions. They needed ideological arguments in order to hold on to a sense of their own rightness. Otherwise, insanity was not far off. How easily one could sympathize with them all. But they all see so clearly what their sufferings were, and they don't see wherein lies their own guilt. This sort of person was not arrested before 1937, and after 1938, very few such people were arrested, and that is why they were named the call-up of 1937. And this would be permissible, but it shouldn't be allowed to blur the overall picture. Even at the peak, they were not the only ones being arrested. And those same peasants and workers and young people and engineers and technicians and agronomists and economists and ordinary believers continued to stream in as well. The call-up of 1937 was very loquacious, and having access to the press and radio created the legend of 1937, a legend consisting of 2 points. One, if they arrested people at all under the Soviet government, it was only in 1937, and it is necessary to speak out and be indignant only about 1937. 2, in 1937, they were the only ones arrested. Here's what they write. That terrible year when they arrested the most devoted communist executives, secretaries of the central committees of the Union Republics, secretaries of the provincial party committees, chairmen of the provincial executive committees, all the commanders of the military districts, of corps, of divisions, marshals and generals, provincial prosecutors, secretaries of district party committees, chairmen of district executive committees. At the very beginning of our book, we gave a conspectus of the waves pouring in the archipelago during the 2 decades up to 1937, how long all that dragged on, and how many millions there were. But the future call-up of 1937 didn't bat an eyelid and found it all normal. We do not know what expressions they used in discussing it among themselves, but P.P. Poskiechev, unaware that he himself was destined to go the same way, spoke like this. In 1931, at a conference of justice officials, quote, while retaining our penal policy in all its severity and cruelty in relation to the class enemy and to déclassé offshoots, unquote, déclassé offshoots, how priceless. Just about anybody could be classified as a déclassé offshoot. In 1932, quote, it is understandable that, in putting them through the crucible of dekulakization, we must never lose sight of the fact that this kulak of yesterday has not morally disarmed. And again, quote, in no case must the sharp blade of penal policy become dull. And that blade, Pavel Petrovich, was so sharp, and that crucible so very hot. R. M. Gurr explained it like this, quote, so long as the arrests involved people who were unknown or scarcely known to me, I and my acquaintances had no doubt about the well-foundedness of those arrests. But when people close to me were arrested, and I myself was arrested, and when I encountered dozens of the most loyal communists in prison, then, unquote. In a word, they remained calm while society was being imprisoned. Their outraged reason boiled when their own fellowship began to be imprisoned. Stalin violated a taboo that appeared firmly established, and that was why they had led such a gay life. Of course they were stunned. Of course it was a fantastic thing to have to grasp. And in the cells they asked heatedly, comrades, do you know the coup was this? Who seized power in our city? And for a long time after, as they became convinced of the irrevocability of their fate, they sighed and groaned, if only Lenin were alive, this never would have happened. What did they mean by this? Was it not precisely this that had happened to the others before them? See Part 1, Chapters 8 and 9. But, nonetheless, they were government people, enlightened Marxists, theoreticians, and how did they cope with this ordeal? How did they reprocess and make sense of an historical event not previously digested nor explained in the newspapers, and historical events always swoop down unexpectedly. Dragged roughly for years down a false trail, they offered explanations astonishing in their profundity. 1. It is a very cunning work of foreign intelligence services. 2. It is wrecking on an enormous scale. Wreckers have taken over the NKVD. A variation of this was German agents had taken over the NKVD. 3. It is a plot by local NKVD men. And in all three cases, the message was this, that we ourselves were blamed for relaxing our vigilance. Stalin doesn't know anything. Stalin doesn't know about these arrests. When he finds out, he will destroy them all and free us. 4. In the ranks of the party, there was a terrible treason. But why? And the entire country was teeming with enemies. And the majority of people here have been correctly arrested. They aren't communists, but counter-revolutionaries. And in the cells, you have to take precautions and be careful not to speak in their presence. I am the only one here who is completely innocent. Well, you too, maybe. This was the variation which was adopted by Mechanician, a former member of the Revolutionary War Council. In other words, let him out, give him his way, and see how many he arrests. 5. These repressions are a historical necessity for the development of our society. This was how a few of the theoreticians talked who had not lost their self-possession, as, for example, a professor from the Plekhanov Institute of National Economy. This explanation was a sure one, and one had to admire how quickly and correctly he had understood it. But none of them ever explained what laws they had in mind, and they just kept blowing on the same flute from their permanent selection. Quote, the historical necessity of development, unquote. You can spout that nonsense about anything and you'll always be right. Amen. And in all 5 variations, no one, of course, accused Stalin. He remained an uneclipsed sun. And if one day one of the old party members, like, for example, Alexander Ivanovich Yashkovich, the Belarusian censor, wheezed from the corner of the cell that Stalin was no right-handed Lenin, but a dog, and until he croaked, nothing good would happen. They would hurl themselves on such a person with fists and hurry to denounce him to their interrogator. It is impossible to imagine to oneself a good thinker who for one moment, in a daydream, would let out a peep about the death of Stalin. Right on that level of inquisitive thought is where the year 1937 caught up with the Loyalist Orthodox communists. And what kind of an attitude to their trial were they left with? Evidently, like Parsons in Orwell's 1984, quote, you don't think the party would arrest an innocent man? Unquote. Quote, thank you. I'm going to say to the tribunal, thank you for saving me before it was too late. Unquote. And what way out did they find for themselves? What active decision did their revolutionary theory indicate? Their decision is just as priceless as their explanations. Here is what it is. The more people that are arrested, the quicker those at the top are going to understand their mistake, and therefore one has to try to name as many names as possible. One has to give as much fantastic testimony as possible against innocence. They won't arrest the entire party. But Stalin didn't need the whole party. All he needed was leadership and the members with seniority. Just as out of the new members of all the Russian parties, it was the communists who turned out to be the first to give false testimony against themselves. So too, they were the first to make the merry-go-round discovery that you should name as many names as possible. Russian revolutionaries had never heard anything like that. Was it their short-sightedness that showed itself in this theory? The poverty of their ideas? I sensed instinctively that this was not the case, that what moved them here was fear, and that this theory was only a handy camouflage to cover up their weakness, for after all, they called themselves long since unlawfully revolutionary. But when they looked inside themselves, they shuddered. It turned out that they were incapable of standing up to the interrogator, and this theory freed them from the necessity of struggling against the interrogator. They ought to have been able to understand at least this, that for Stalin, this purge of the party was necessary in order to downgrade the party itself in comparison with him, for he himself did not have the genius to rise in comparison with the party, even such as it was. I'm going to stop there. I'll just keep reading this like a rant. This is such an important section. I'll have to listen to this again. Sometimes you don't absorb as you read, and listening again and again, you absorb it. What a great chapter, every word. What a great part. We're not even done, but what a great, powerful section. Thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good day.